All right, hi friends. Today we're doing our first lecture on the book Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, which is by Seth Holmes. This one right here. And you probably are reading an online version of it, or maybe you're listening to the audio version. I love this book. I think we're going to have a good time talking about it. For today's lecture, or this week's lecture, I just want to cover some of the basic concepts that we're going to be talking about throughout the book, and they kind of frame the introduction and some of the big ideas that he presents in the second chapter as well. All right, so first a little bit of theory. Just a funny little comic here for you to enjoy. I'll give you a moment to read that. I feel like I should sing some background music for you or something. All right, so one of the concepts that comes up a lot throughout this book, implicitly in the first chapter, as Holmes describes his own experience of border crossing, and then very explicitly as he talks about the experience and the wear and tear on his body of being a migrant fruit picker with the Triqui migrants with whom he works, is this idea of embodiment. So anthropologists think about the body not as just sort of like a thing that happens to be there as the mind and spirit and soul experiences something, but that as a physical entity that's being shaped by the experience that one is having in life. So bodies are more than just biological entities, but they carry social meanings and are marked by social experiences. And the experience of a fruit picker is a really excellent way to explore this concept. So one of the main theorists that Holmes uses, and that also lots of people who talk about embodiment uses, Pierre Bourdieu, and he has this idea of habitus. So habitus, I think, actually was an Aristotelian idea originally from Aristotle, but he sort of incorporated into a practice theory of anthropology that looks at how people live and what their bodies do in space. So Bourdieu says that habitus is a system of embodied dispositions that shape how we perceive the social world. So he sort of says like the layered movements of our body over time become inscribed in our persons in these subconscious ways that we don't even realize, but they also mark our bodies in certain ways. So, for example, if you took my intro to anthro class, you would have watched the film called African Burial Ground about the skeletons found underneath New York City that wasn't as used to be a slave burial ground. Um, and the markings and the wear and tear on the bones of the slaves that the archaeologists examine clearly shows their embodied experience of their servitude and the labor that they had to do as slaves. Um, so migrant fruit picking would be another really good example, and we'll talk a lot more about the body and the embodied experience. But Bourdieu even talks about like the way, you might bend over or do things with your body within your home, the way your experience is shaped by your relationship, your body's relationship to the world. So it's like these habits that your body accrues that they don't even realize they're doing. So in this book, Holmes uses his own body to try and understand the embodied experience of being a fruit picker and someone who lives in a cramped apartment and who travels by car, between states during the picking season and that sort of thing. And he has very poignant examples in the second chapter of the things that his body is experiencing. And later in the week on our discussion board, and hopefully on Thursday, if you join us for the Zoom drop in, we'll talk about what the limitations of the wear and tear on his body are, that he's doing them temporarily, that he's also a privileged person who's getting a PhD in anthropology and a medical degree at the same time, right? So he's clearly, whereas these pickers are going to be moving in these spaces and using their bodies in this ways for decades. And so that's an interesting question that we can talk about. So one of the big concepts that he also talks about here is this idea of structural violence. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what structural violence is and how it relates to health. So Holmes, on page 43 at the end of the second chapter that you read for this week, says, by structural violence, I mean the violence committed by configurations of social inequalities that in the end has injurious effects on bodies similar to the violence of a stabbing or a shooting. So it's an idea that he's borrowed from Paul Farmer, who's also borrowed it from other people, but really made it sort of popular. I guess popular might be a weird word for it, but you know what I mean. Anyways, but structural inequalities or inequalities that lead some people to need to be fruit pickers and to have to cross borders illegally, that sort of thing, actually cause physical harm. And throughout the book, he demonstrates that. He's a medical anthropologist as well, like I am. So the structural inequalities lead to violence on humans, the same way that a stabbing or shooting might have violence on people. And maybe it leads to someone in Lesotho, for example, being more likely to die of AIDS. So it's not maybe as immediate as a stabbing or shooting, but it is real bodily harm. I've got a quote by Paul Farmer here just to kind of reinforce this idea. But he says, poor people's sickness is a result of the structural violence. So neither culture nor pure individual will is at fault. And Holmes talks a lot about this individuality in the first chapter, and that's something that we'll talk about on the discussion board this week as well. But it's historically given, meaning produced by history, by who, where you happen to live, what colonizer you happen to have in your past, and that sort of thing, and is often driven by economy or economically driven. It's historically given processes and forces conspire to constrain individual agency. And of course, agency means someone's individual ability to act, in their own interest and to choose what they get to do. Like, yes, migrants, these Triqui migrant fruit pickers are choosing to cross the border, right? But the main discussion board post for this week kind of asks you to think about what kind of a choice is that, or what does it mean to choose when your choice is working an extremely difficult job that pays very little and does great harm to your body. And he says structural violence is visited upon all those whose social status denies them access to the fruits of scientific and social progress. So, like Holmes, he's a medical anthropologist and a doctor. Has primarily done a lot of work in Haiti, but also has a NGO that works all over the world. This is Paul Farmer I'm talking about. But basically, based on where you're situated, do you have access to the things that can make you lead a healthy life and have a healthy body? And if not, then you're a product of structural violence. And then Holmes also introduces this idea of symbolic violence. So coming from Bourdieu again, he says that the inequalities in society that are rooted in symbolic forms, and symbolic being dress, language, race, ethnicity, come to be seen as natural, as in like this Triqui Mexicans are sort of socially or symbolically lesser than mestizo Mexicans, who are lesser than Americans, white Americans, right? So there's symbolic violence that is inflicted upon people and often internalized by marginalized people, just the way that people deferred to Holmes while he was crossing the border and the way that he was treated differently. I think a great example of this is the Burger King example, where he goes with the family to have Burger King after they get their paycheck, and they give them all the wrong size fries. They give them medium instead of large fries, and he says, "Let's go tell them that they gave us the wrong size fries." And his friends are like, "No way, we can't do that. They would never give it to us." And it's putting them at risk, or at risk of being reported, but also at risk of just being ashamed again and made to seem lesser. And that's the symbolic violence. And of course, Holmes takes the fries up to the front and is able to get new fries, and just sort of evidence of that privilege. And basically, Holmes is arguing that symbolic violence and structural violence work together to form the nexus of violence and suffering through which the phenomenon of migrant labor in North America is produced. So it's really the combination of these two forms of violence that people are physically harmed and also sort of emotionally harmed, I guess you could say, or like their dignity is harmed by this symbolic violence, and that put those two together, and it's a sort of perfect storm. So one other idea that he doesn't bring up, but that I wanted to talk to you about, is this idea of structurally vulnerable populations. So we'll talk about what that means, and let me kind of parse through this quote for you. So an individual, sorry, I had to go sneeze for a second. Okay, I'm back. So structurally vulnerable populations, this is Bourdieu, another person who has done some really interesting work around structural violence. He says an individual's or a population's condition of being at risk for negative health outcomes through their interface or their interactions with socioeconomic, political, and cultural normative hierarchies. So basically, people are more or less at risk depending on where they are on the socioeconomic, political ladder or hierarchies. Patients are structurally vulnerable when their location in their society's multiple overlapping and mutually reinforcing power hierarchies. So that's another way of saying they're intersectional identities. So they're vulnerable when their intersectional identities like socioeconomic, racial, cultural, and institutional and policy level statuses like their immigration status, what kind of job they hold in the labor force, constrain their ability to access healthcare and pursue healthy lifestyles. So it's like the cracks in the safety net or the system that make a person more vulnerable based on both their like identities and their statuses and jobs to being healthy. And that's what structurally vulnerable populations are. Hopefully that makes some sense to you. And so one of the questions I'm going to ask throughout the week is, how are the people in Fresh Fruit Broken Bodies? And feel free to use FFBB when you're writing in your posts because it's a long title to keep rewriting. How are the people in Fresh Fruit Broken Bodies structurally vulnerable? Like, what are the ways in which they're structurally vulnerable? Because that kind of reveals the choices they're having to make. All right, that's it for today. And I look forward to talking to you about this. I can figure out how to turn this off.